The surfaces are what we see in the 3D window. Currently I'm using a view, which we can find under 3D view options, called detailed shading and shadows. And that means that it looks relatively close to what it would look like when rendered, a photo render in Cinerender, or ideally what it would look like in the real world environment. Now we also see that the advantage of this view is that it has a line, it has a black line around the edge. Now it might have a different color line depending on what pen we assign to it, but I like the fact that it has black lines. So we get an idea of the surface of what we're trying to create, and that's useful in terms of an ArchiCAD model. Sometimes this can be too much, and when we're first in a design process, what I recommend is that we simplify this process more, such as maybe a white model, so that we're not so overly focused on assigning surfaces. However, once we need to start to understand the differentiation between surfaces or materials, it's important to use a view which identifies these properly. View, 3D view options. To understand this better, we can go into our 3D styles. And this just gives us a bigger list of each of these and explains how they work. So on the left is our presets. Under our 3D engine, it's important that we're using an OpenGeo engine, not a vectorial engine, if we're wanting to fly around the model. If we use our vectorial engine, it's not as smooth, it's clunky, and it will change to the wireframe as we try to orbit or explore the model. So it's really important that we use the OpenGL, as that's going to give us a better representation, but also make it faster for navigation purposes. Now, we've got transparency automatically turned on here, which means we can see through the windows as long as the surface of the windows is transparent. Every element can have a level of transparency. And in this case, we see that my window setting, called glass, has some transparency. It's not completely transparent. We can't see through it like it doesn't exist, but we can see through it partially. And of course, we can reassign or adjust the representation or amount of transparency that we apply to any surface. Now, we can change the transparency. We can turn that off. In this case, we can change the monochromatic nature of the model, or we can turn that off. I can, of course, create more of these. I can create new styles. So if I want to create my own style and change the way that this is represented, we can do that as well. And so we can go new. We can create one called 3D model true, meaning that we're trying to represent it as true life as possible, possibly. We could turn transparency off, we could leave it on. I generally like to leave transparency on, and then if I want something to be very transparent, I change its setting to be very transparent. If I want something to not be very transparent, then I adjust it in its setting, which might mean that I have different types of glass. Glass that's supposed to be very transparent, and glass that's not supposed to be very transparent. Now for true model, I definitely don't want monochromatic on. I probably want to try to show the sky as a light blue, and maybe I want to show the ground as a black or a green. It doesn't really matter. This isn't necessarily, I'm not talking about the surfaces of elements, so I'm not talking about my terrain mesh in this case. I'm talking about the background of the screen. I can also make this as in photo render. So if I'm using particular settings in the photo render or a background image, it could show that as well. Contours, how do I want to show these? Draft best. Obviously this is just the amount of work that goes into it. Shadows, do I want to show shadows? Yes. Now that will slow down my model a little bit, but it's going to make it more realistic. And then when I'm happy with this, I can press OK. And that's going to adjust the representation. So we see the background here is quite colorful. Now, why is this useful? Maybe it's giving me an idea of horizon. If this was all white, it's a little bit hard for me to understand where horizon is. And so that might mean I then choose in my explore option to look up a bit more or look down a little bit more. And that's going to change where my horizon sits on the page. And just in terms of in relationship to, is it in the middle of my view? Is the horizon at the top of my view? Is the horizon at the bottom of my view? And that helps me to understand whether I'm looking up, looking down, or just looking straight ahead. Now this is really important when we're creating our views for renders. It's of course not very important when we're just moving around our model. exploring our model, either using the Explore tool or exploring our model using the Orbit tool. Now, when it comes to assigning surfaces, we can do this in a variety of ways. We could select the Wall tool, select Control A, Command A on a Mac, and it will select all of the walls. I could not select the Wall tool, have nothing selected, press Control A, and it will select every element. I could use my marquee, put a marquee in plan over part of those elements and select it. I could do that in 3D as well. Or a better way of finding things is through Edit, Find and Select. And here we can use multiple criteria to find something. Now I can create that criteria myself, or I can pick up that criteria to a degree. So if I click on this wall, click Alt to select it, it's automatically going to say wall. That's what I'm selecting. Now that seemed pretty obvious, but now I can add in additional criteria. So as I look at this, I can find in the menu what I'm wanting. So a good way to define this at the moment would be based on what's the current surface represented as. So I'll go to Surface, I'll click Add, and we see that it says that I'm talking about brick running bond, but this doesn't look like brick running bond. That's because I need to re-select it. Alt, click, pick it up, and we see it's now changed to AED rammed earth. And I can keep going with this and add more and more and more criteria as necessary to select things just the way they need to be. Once I'm finished that, I can then press plus, and that will now select all of the elements that are walls that are currently on a surface called rammed earth, and then I can choose to change them to a different surface. At the moment, we see that there is no override. So the surface is being defined by the materiality itself. We call this the building material. If I wanted, for instance, part of these walls to have a different surface on the outside or the inside or the edge, then I could choose to override any one of these three options. And in walls, we have three different parts: an inside face, an outside face, and an edge face. When we look at columns, or beams, or slabs, or roofs, we have different ways of differentiating the surfaces of sides or parts of those objects. So this allows us to select, refine, or redefine the way that we do our views. Now, if I was happy with the selections of these being rammed earth, but I wasn't happy with how the rammed earth looked, then I'd need to go into the not into the wall itself, but into the Options, Element Attributes, Surface Settings, and this is where I can change the representation of that. Now it automatically took us to not the one that we were after. If I Alt-click this wall, Options, Element Attributes, Surfaces, theoretically it's supposed to take me to the surface that I'm after. When I select this wall, go into the setting, we see that it sort of is. It's taking me to the potential override surface, but in reality that's not what it is. If I select all of these, go into the settings here and choose rammed earth, now I don't need to be overriding this because it already is the right materials, but if I do that, then pick up the settings, Option, Element, Attributes, Surfaces, we see it's actually going to take me to the surface that I have selected so I can find it more quickly. Now, of course, that was a long way around, but that, of course, applies to other surfaces as well. Now, once I'm in this surface, what am I looking at? What's important? I'm currently in my basic engine. I could change this to my OpenGL engine. So this is the representation of each of these views. And we see that generally speaking, the basic engine and the OpenGL engine is going to be mostly the same, except maybe just the representation of light. Now it's very important that these also match with the Cinerender engine and its interpretation of the surface if I'm going to be using the Cinerender engine to render or do a photo render of my house. If I'm not, if I'm going to export this into Twinmotion, that's not as important because I can always, in Twinmotion, assign a different texture, a different surface, or Lumion, or whatever other rendering program I'm using. So we first, I would suggest, use OpenGL or Basic Engine to assign the view, and that defines what it looks like here in our 3D window, in our OpenGL window. I can here define the surface color. Now the surface color is not insignificant. This is important because this surface color represents what I'll be seeing in elevation. So when I'm viewing my house in elevation, this is the color that I'm seeing. I'm also seeing overlaid over that a vectorial hatching. So I see a surface color and a vectorial hatch, and the pen line here defines the thickness and color potentially, but the thickness most importantly of the lines in that elevation. Under my texture, this is where I can attach a picture, and this picture of course is the representation that we see not in elevation but in 3D and then ultimately in the photo render. I can change its proportion, I can change its size, I can change its rotation, and then I can change the way it's mapped, and then I can add channels or effects to this. Now these are very simplified versions of all of the channels that we get under our Cinerender options. We see all of these here. And this is where we can and should be adding lots of detail if we're using Cinerender. Again, if we're not, it's a waste of time. So I want you to prioritize this last. The first thing that I would like you to focus on is making sure that the surfaces represent properly in your Basic Engine OpenGL engine. Again, we don't need to do both, we can just do one. And then once we've made it look good here, generally speaking, what we're then going to do finally is change the Cinerender match settings. You have to get this the right way around, otherwise you'll end up wasting your time. And we're going to update Cinerender from basic, which means we're making Cinerender look like the basic view. We're making the texture be assigned based on the basic view. So if you've set it up in basic, this is the option you want to do. If you've done it the other way around, if you've set it up in Cinerender, you want to use this option, update basic settings from Cinerender. So you're making the OpenGL view look like how you've created in Cinerender. So if you're definitely using Cinerender as your rendering engine and you want to make the surfaces look more believable and more realistic, this would be the option that you use. Now there's a lot of settings here, so we're only going to focus on doing one at a time. Effectively, back to our basic engine. We're going to first start with this. We need to make the representation of the surface color correct because that's what we see in elevation. We need to make sure that we've got a good vectorial hatch assigned because that's what we're going to see in elevation, and we need to use a correct element pen. I don't like the element pen, I like overriding it because this again is just the outside fill, not the edges of the walls or the edges of the slabs, and I'm going to make that a very thin pen. And then I need to have a texture applied if I want it to look realistic in OpenGL, and then potentially if I want to use that in Cinerender. If you'd like to learn more about ArchiCAD, enroll in a short course at archi-ed.com.